Alright guys, today we're going to be talking about how does the Supreme Court work and how do you get like your case on the Supreme Court and what type of powers does the Supreme Court have. So let's first look at this chart right here. This is a little bit of a chart slash map of all the court levels in our country. So how you go from like a very small court like probate court or bankruptcy court all the way to like your state Supreme Court, all the way to eventually the United States Supreme Court. So the way our judicial system works in the United States, you could, in theory, start off in your local courthouse, which for us would be Palm Beach County Courthouse. You could potentially appeal your case, and if granted appealed, you would end up all the way to the Florida Supreme Court potentially. And if in the Florida Supreme Court they weren't able to figure it out for you, you might find yourself all the way in the National Supreme Court in Washington, D.C. So there are ways to take your case and go all the way to eventually the United States Supreme Court. Uh, but that's not really fun to kind of visualize without a visualization. So let me give you an example of how that might work. So here's a problem. Let's say Mr. Shoens decided to spend all that sweet hard-earned teaching money, which isn't a lot, to buy a Lamborghini. And let's say he also decided to buy a Batman costume or reuse the one he had in Spirit Week his senior year in high school, whatever one still fits. And let's say hypothetically he did 200 miles an hour while wearing the Batman suit while driving the Lamborghini in a school zone in Virginia. What happens to Mr. Shoens in that situation? It doesn't matter that he is Batman. He is getting arrested like a boss. Now, that being said, is that the end of the story for Mr. Shoens? They just throw him in the jail cell. He just sits next to his new best friend to the right there, and he just stays in his Batman costume forever? No, that's not how our judicial system works. You have your day in court, and you will end up in a courtroom. And for time's sake, I'm not going to go all the way at the bottom level with like Palm Beach County Courthouse. I'm going to start at the federal level. Let's start right here. So at least on the national level, the first level of the federal court system is the district courts. Now, district courts will handle all general trials involving the United States of America. You'll have both civil as well as criminal cases can go here. So if it's a case that goes against like a federal law, not like a state law, federal courts can't rule on state laws, they can only rule on national laws, you will find yourself in a district court. There are 94 total district courts throughout the United States. They handle about 300,000 cases a year, which sounds like a lot, but compared to the state level, which we'll talk about in federalism, it is astronomically smaller. But they do handle about 80% of all the federal cases in a year. In case you're wondering where the closest one is for us, there is your district court. So let's say hypothetically Mr. Shoens has his day in trial, just like all criminals do. They have a judge, a jury, a prosecution, all that different stuff. Hopefully you know all those things, and hopefully you know that since this is a criminal case, it would need 12 votes on a jury to convict him. But if you look at the picture to the right, do you notice something in this picture might suggest that this courtroom might be a little bit biased? Yeah, because the courtroom is full of jokers and the person on trial is Batman. Of course, they're all going to be biased. So in my hypothetical situation, let's say they pronounce guilty, I'm going to appeal at that point, saying that the jury and the judge were biased. And if the court deems it appropriate, if they think, yep, he was right, then you have the Court of Appeals. So they handle all the appeals from the district courts of the United States. In any court case, regardless of what your outcome is, you have the right to an appeal. Now, you might not be granted that appeal, but you do have the right towards one. And then another judge in a higher court level is going to look at your trial and see whether or not justice was done. If they don't think justice was done, then you'll be subject to another trial, and you continue on into the levels of the judicial system. They're also called the Circuit Court of Appeals because they're all connected like in a circuit throughout our country. There's one in West Palm Beach. Granted, this is the older building. If you do go down to like West Palm now, you probably won't see him in this building anymore. You'll see him in the much nicer building. Okay, back to our hypothetical situation. So the appeals court has to decide, Do they give Mr. Shoens a redo essentially, or do they just throw him in jail and just confirm what the lower court did? Tough decision, but let's say they give him another trial. And let's say, skipping a few beats, let's say it's appealed again, and then it finally lands on the level of the Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court's the highest court in our federal system. Once it reaches here, whatever verdict they come up with is final. There's no appealing past the Supreme Court. So let's say hypothetically a court case did land on the doorstep of the Supreme Court. What's that process look like? Well, first they have to decide whether or not they want to review it. Now, all these cases have gone through a lot of different courtrooms before it reaches the Supreme Court. Every single one of these courtrooms essentially has dealt with this case. So the Supreme Court of the United States may not deem an appeal. They might just say, no, the other courts figured it out, and then we'll just deal with it there. But let's say they think, you know what, justice wasn't done, we should really take this case. Well, once they choose a case, next they'll pick the arguments and they'll hear it from both sides. Now, they have the transcripts from all the other court dates, so it's not like they don't know anything about this case. And this is more for clarity, some final questions, final appeals. The 9 justices on the Supreme Court will ask many questions at that point. And then once the oral arguments are done, it's up to the Supreme Court to then make a decision. The 9 justices will then discuss the case and call for a vote. The Chief Justice will be the one who enacts this, and a simple majority decides the cases. And then once all the arguments are done, the Supreme Court will then vote on it. The Supreme Court Chief Justice will call for a vote, and they will discuss the case amongst each other. Each justice will have a chance to speak, and then they will cast their vote. A simple majority will be deciding the case, so they need 5 of 9 votes. If 5 justices agree off the bat, then they can just call it there and then just move on. It becomes down between 4 versus 4, then the Chief Justice will be the one that beats the tiebreaker. Now, that's how the Supreme Court functions, but to put in perspective just how often you see this, the Supreme Court will hear anywhere between 50 to 80 cases a year, but they'll see well over 7,000 requests a year. It's only one courtroom with 9 justices, so obviously it would be impossible to fulfill all those requests. And these are the 3 things that each justice is taking into consideration whenever they make a judgment call. So let's talk about the most powerful power of the Supreme Court. You ever see Avengers Infinity War, and you know who Thanos is and what that Infinity Gauntlet is and what does it do? Well, what power does Thanos ultimately use at the end of the movie? Spoiler alert, he snaps his fingers and then half of everything as far as people just disappear. So my question for you here is, remember those previous 2 branches, the legislative and the executive branch? What if hypothetically the legislative branch passed a law totally against the Constitution, like saying freedom of speech is no more? And let's say the President of the United States signs it. The question then at that point is, what will we do as a nation at that point? Literally 2/3 of our government literally just passed a stupid law. Would all hope be lost? Well, no, because the Supreme Court has a powerful power known as judicial review. Judicial review is the ability of the Supreme Court to overturn any law that goes in conflict with the Constitution, meaning even if the legislative branch had all people in Congress agree, the President of the United States signs it. If it ultimately goes against the Constitution, the judicial branch can overrule both branches of government simultaneously. So if there's any law that goes against the Constitution, they simply get rid of it. So if the Supreme Court sees something that goes against the Constitution, just like Thanos, it has the power to make that law disappear. But where does that power ultimately come from? Well, like most things in government, whether it be the Supremacy Clause, Commerce Clause, Elastic Clause, those articles, you'll probably find it somewhere in the Constitution. Article 3 talks about the judicial branch, so it would be logical to look there for where it says about judicial review, right? Well, normally if we were in the classroom, I'd have you look through Article 3 to try to find it and offer some extra credit, but since we're here, it's nowhere to be found. The concept of judicial review is nowhere in the Constitution, which is kind of ironic because that would make it an unconstitutional thing, and this is the power to overturn unconstitutional things. This is a power the Supreme Court gave itself very early on in the court's history in a case called Marbury v. Madison. So, the long story short, and you should have read it on Tuesday, it was 1803 and our country was still relatively young, and there was a bug in our judicial system that appeared. Now, what was that situation? Long story short, the President of the United States at the time, John Adams, appointed a ton of new judges on his way out the door, like literally the night before the new president was inaugurated. And William Marbury was one of those judges that were supposed to be appointed. Unfortunately, because of communication back then, not all of them got confirmed in time. And when they ran out of time, Thomas Jefferson then became president of the United States, and he said, no, I don't want these guys to be my judges. I'm a different political party. I want my guys in. So Marbury doesn't get his job, essentially, that he was supposed to get. The president approved, and even the Senate confirmed. So Marbury did the only logical thing. He sued. He wrote something known as a writ of mandamus, which is basically a formal complaint that a government official isn't doing their job. And then you have the Marbury and Marbury v. Madison. James Madison was the person who was supposed to deliver the commission in time, but just couldn't because there was too many commissions to be delivered. So he sues. Who takes the case? Well, the case found its way on the Supreme Court because of a bill that Congress passed a few years prior. It was called the Judiciary Act of 1789. Essentially, you needed to have a courtroom in DC to take regular stuff like crimes and stuff. So the Judiciary Act gave original jurisdiction to the Supreme Court in all cases happening in DC. However, there was a problem with this. The Supreme Court can only have appellate jurisdiction. Basically, what jurisdiction is, it's the ability to have power to rule over a case. So, like if a cop pulls you over in West Palm Beach and you live in Detroit, Michigan, because the crime happened in West Palm Beach jurisdiction, they have the ability to rule against you, and your courtroom will be there and all that different stuff. The Constitution never wanted to give the Supreme Court original jurisdiction in anything. They only wanted to give them appellate jurisdiction, meaning the ability to take an appeal for a case. So you have a law that Congress passed, which was saying that the Supreme Court should have original jurisdiction, and you have the Constitution saying it only has appellate jurisdiction. So who ultimately wins the case? Technically nobody, because Marbury is not going to get his job, but the big winner was the Supreme Court because they ruled basically because the Judiciary Act went against the Constitution, we can't rule on this case because the Constitution says we're not supposed to have this case. So they established the concept of judicial review. They said because the Judiciary Act goes against the Constitution, we're striking it, we're voiding it, and we're going with what the Constitution says. Now, why is that important? Well, if you remember that key term precedent, well, now in the future, because of that example the Supreme Court left, if there was ever another case brought to the Supreme Court that had a law that went against the Constitution, the Supreme Court has established that they can overturn it and they can ultimately get rid of it. And that's what ultimately makes judicial review. It's not something that the Constitution grants the judicial branch. It's something that they gave themselves, and they have kept it to this day.